Hello, my name is Jean and I am a knitter. And today I want to talk about lifelines and what I did for Knit in Public Day. I'm working on a pattern called Wild Swan. It is a free pattern from Ravelry that was quite popular a few years back, but it is large and it is lacy. And the pattern is charted only, so if you do not read charts, I don't recommend this pattern. But I love this pattern. I love this pattern. I've always wanted to knit it, and I tried once and the yarn was too fine, and then I tried again with a larger, heavier weight yarn that I had frogged a project. And it's coming along beautifully. Now what you're going to see is that I have like 9 zillion stitch markers in this. And some of them are split ring markers, and some of them are regular markers. Now, a split ring marker is something that works a bit like a safety pin. You can open it, you can put it in place, close it, it will stay there. When you want to take it out of where it is, you unpin it and remove it. This means that in the middle of my knitting, here, this is a regular stitch marker, and I can't take it off my knitting needle. But if I had a split ring marker, I could open it up and remove it. Now you will notice that I have this split ring marker on something that, this is not my knitting. This is it's a little, there you go. What I have it on is a lifeline. And a lifeline is basically not really a knitting needle, but it goes into your knitting, and it's a flexible cord that will save your place. You will not drop a stitch off of this cord because it's woven, it's in your knitting as if it were a knitting needle. And if I were to have a horrible disaster and needed to rip back to a row where I knew where I was, I would have that lifeline in place. I could rip back to that cord and then pick up my stitches from the cord and never lose a stitch. Now, how did I get it there? It didn't just magically grow there. I put it in place deliberately. There are 2 different ways you can put a lifeline in. I use a brand of knitting needle, Gu, and they are cable. I have a cable set. I have multiple sets of cables. And the cables have a hole in them. And the hole goes all the way through. And I can put something through that hole. No, I don't want to put a stitch marker through that hole. What I want to do is put a cable through that hole. And some people will use a strand of embroidery floss. I once tried fishing line. That's not a good idea, because if you get colored fishing line so you can see it, the color rubs off and your knitting now has a streak of color along one row. That's not good. What I use is called Easy Count Guideline. And this is where cross-crafting knowledge comes in handy. This is used for embroidery. It is not used or expected to be used for knitting, but it's a thin, very thin, and it's actually pretty strong, and it will easily fit through these holes, and then I can tie knots in it. But what I end up doing is cutting a length that's several times longer than my cables usually, and I double it and tie a knot at one end. Now, this is important. If I am knitting from my left needle onto the right needle, I better have my lifeline attached to the right needle. Otherwise, my stitches don't end up on it, and I end up having to do weird, slidey, flippy, it's nasty. But what I end up with is, and maybe you can see it, maybe you can't, but I end up with a cord there that goes through my knitting, but it's not the cable of my cable needle. And if I had to rip back, when I got to this row, I've got steps on each end, so I can't go any further than that row. And then I can pick up using the cord instead of a needle, and it works just fine. Now, this has saved me because I knew when I was working with my pattern, as I read the notes, I had the next 2 working rows, I moved the stitch markers on each of those 2 rows, 53 and 55 or 63 and 65, I don't know. I purl back on the even numbered rows, and I knit pattern on the odd numbered rows. So when I say the next 2 rows and I give you 3 numbers away, well, yeah, that's why. I had to move them on 63, I knit back plain on 64, and then I had to move them again on row 65. Which means, since I knew I was going to be knitting in public, I also knew I was going to be interrupted very frequently, and that was going to cause me to lose my place, and I just knew it. I wasn't able to get past that row before knit in public, but I did put in my lifeline before I needed it. So I did my best, I worked very slowly, I double and triple checked, and when I went to count my stitches before I started on the next row, I had a disaster. I have a pattern repeat to one side of the center stitches, and I have a pattern repeat to the other side of the center stitches, and it's 3 times this way and 3 times that way. And they're supposed to be mirror images, so it looks nice. Each one of these pattern repeats had a different number of stitches, 30, 32, and 34. Each one of these had 32, 32, 32. But the center stitches didn't have the right number of stitches, and the stitches before the pattern repeat and the stitches after the pattern repeat were also wrong. So I had to go backwards. So I started tinking carefully, and I tinked my way back, and I got to the next row that was pattern, and I counted, and it was also wrong. So I went tink, 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 and I got to where I knew I was right because I could count my stitches and they were correct based on the pattern, and I did not have to go all the way back to my lifeline, but I wasn't stressed out because I knew that even if I had to go back to the lifeline, I knew I was perfect right there. And I could move forward, leaving the lifeline in place if I even wanted to. I could move forward from there and try another time to concentrate and get all those stitch patterns correct. Oh my goodness. Well, me putting in a lifeline was not a big deal because I had the hole through my cable of the cable needle. And that's how I've always done my lifelines, because I prefer working on cable needles than I do working on straights. So even when I'm working a pattern that goes back and forth, I go back and forth on my cable needles. Many people do not have that luxury. So I was thinking, well, what do they do? Because I've always had these when I needed to put in a lifeline. And I thought, and I thought, and I thought, and I realized that's what you need. A needle that you thread with a piece of yarn that is a bright, screaming, contrasting color. And you can, as you are knitting, just slide that needle through a few stitches at a time, pulling your lifeline through. Or, that's a lifeline I would call an active lifeline. Or you can do what I call a posthumous lifeline, and I have seen that done, and I'm not a fan of it, especially in dark, heavily patterned lace knitting, which is what I'm doing. You hold your knitting out, and you weave your needle through each stitch. So what you're going to do is, where you have your V's, you're going to go over the right side of the V and under the left side of the V. And then you go to the next stitch and you go over the left side and over the right, under the left, over the right, under the left, over the right, under the left. And then you hope that you got it right and you didn't jump to a different row in the middle of your lifeline. And yeah. Or skip a stitch, go over 2 instead of over 1. I would much rather, as I knit a few stitches, run through, pull my cord, knit a few stitches, run through, pull my cord, knit a few stitches, run through, pull my cord. It might change your gauge, but it probably won't if you knit a few stitches and then pull the cord through. But if you pull the cord through as you are knitting, you are no longer knitting on a needle the same size as you started. So your gauge will change and your lifeline row will be a little bit off. So make sure you knit a whole bunch of stitches and then pull your cord through a few of those, but not all of them, and then knit some more stitches and then pull your cord through. Make triply, quadruply, million times sure that you have something at the end of your cord that your stitches are not going to slide off of over. Otherwise, your lifeline will just come right back out and you won't have that. So that's a lifeline. Knitting in public was a good deal of fun, but there were challenges because I chose to knit at a local branch of a library. And the library had advertised their gathering and had made it clear that they would teach people how to knit. And I would say at any given time, we had 50% of the group students, and sometimes more than 50% of the time being students. And yes, we do need to grow the next generation of knitters, but it was challenging because I couldn't concentrate on my knitting because I chose to. I was not required to. I chose to help out the beginners. I feel good about one of the ladies that I worked with. She was having some troubles, but she was able to identify what her errors were and then follow directions and correct her errors and move forward in a wonderful way. She got to increases doing yarn overs and decreases knit two togethers, as well as understanding the difference between garter stitch and stockinette stitch. So, hey, that was a major positive. And in the long run, do I regret going out to knit in public? No. Even though I had to rip out probably a full day's effort of my knitting, no, I don't regret going out to knit in public day. I got to sit with other knitters. I got to help a beginner knitter. I was able to direct her to some references. Turns out, yes, she's one of the people that works in the library, so when she had to go in and take her shift, she then popped back out and said, I found that book, and I started reading it, and oh my goodness, that's just so much information. So that was a good thing. And seeing somebody else getting the knitting bug, that was a blast. So if you get a chance to teach, don't regret it. But if you are going to be teaching, don't expect to be doing a lot of your own knitting, because students will not let you count and follow a pattern, because they can't plan when they need help, and you need to help them when they need help. So grow some knitters and just keep knitting.